Hi there, I'm James Brayshaw, and I want to discuss a really important topic with you for a few moments. The question I want to ask today is, why doesn't prayer work to stop Satan and his demons? The passage we're going to look at is Ephesians 6, the famous spiritual warfare passage, and there's very few people who understand it in religion today the way Paul intended it to be understood. Here, let's have a read of that. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. So what does Paul have to say about principalities in this passage? The principalities is a word that's interpreted from the Greek word arche, and it simply has a different meaning than what religion has imposed upon it today. The meaning of the word arche, which is translated as principalities, is not intended to speak of a supernatural foe of any nature. Rather, it's intended to speak of a origin or a beginning of some point. What we're going to find by examining Paul's thinking that underlies the statement we have in the English New Testament is that Paul is referring to a battle that is not against flesh and blood. Rather, it's against a beginning of thinking, or the original concepts that were brought out against the truth that he was there to teach. And in fact, we can learn that it is an intention by man to try to justify his own belief system. That's an intention that always lies in man, and man has always struggled with it. So far, what Paul has been telling us is that man's battle is an internal battle, either against his own internal nature, or a battle against the original drive of man to use the liberty to choose. It's also a battle against that power of choice as it is seen in other men who make choices to teach things that go against the truth Paul knew to be truth. So, Paul talks about the principalities and says our struggle is against them. One of the very interesting challenges we have when looking at Paul's meaning in this famous spiritual warfare passage is to find out what the word powers meant to him. If we look at some of his other words where he writes to Titus, we find Paul was referring to the principalities and powers as something we need to subject ourselves to, as opposed to something that's supernatural in nature and we need to fight against. Why, as we see in Titus 3:1, put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, and then he goes on in the next sentence to say, to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers. Quite interesting. Here, Paul says, be subject to principalities and powers, whereas in the special Ephesians 6 passage, thought to be about supernatural spiritual warfare, he's saying our battle is against the principalities and powers, but not against flesh and blood. So is our battle against a cosmic entity, or is it against a human being, or is it against a philosophy, an underlying mode of thought, a collective consciousness, a worldview, so to speak, that was prevalent in the period Paul was teaching in? Well, the Greek word that's used here by Paul is exousia, and it's defined as power. We have a way of defining Greek terms and English terms in a way that is convenient to our understanding of certain texts, whereas the biblical speaker, Paul in this case, may have meant something different. And if we look at the definition of exousia, we find it means man's power of choice or liberty of doing as one pleases. Very clearly now, we're finding that Paul was speaking about principalities and powers as something we do battle against, which is a thinking that's found in man, and man's power to choose. The power that we have of the liberty to choose is one of the things we're struggling against. So, is Paul trying to say there are external cosmic forces at war against us? Definitely not. Next, we come across a bit of a different phrase. Paul then tells us, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, which we know to be men, and against the rulers of the darkness of this world. We found in Titus 3 that Paul told us to be subject to principalities and powers, and we see the terms, in fact, can refer to human beings, to men, and the philosophies they maintain. What we find next is that we're also battling against the rulers of darkness of this world. Again, in much of charismatica and Christianity, we find that the rulers of darkness of this world is thought to be supernatural demonic entities that are presently ruling over this world. but I think we can find that to even be referring to something more physically related to humanity. Now, the area of Ephesus wherein Paul was speaking, teaching, writing to, we find that the people in that region were really ignorant of divine things in a lot of ways. Let me rephrase that. They had lots of belief about divine and supernatural things, yet they were ignorant about the divine things Paul was trying to instruct them on. He referred to them as people of darkened sight. So what then is the real struggle? If we think of the real struggle as an instance where someone is trying to teach another person a very important topic or concept or idea, and that person just won't get it, they are blinded to getting that. They are battling against that. That is the struggle. The darkness of this world is the deeply entrenched and erroneous false doctrines and lies people are subject to. Those who propagate and pontificate these false doctrines, now those are the rulers of darkness of this world, because they really rule over the blindness that people are subject to. What then is the spiritual wickedness in heavenly places? And that's how we see it in the English. If we read the word heavenly in the Greek, it can also be translated as high. Some very interesting stuff about the high places that Paul knew about when he was hanging around Ephesus. There were many, many places that were altars and temples to false gods, according to Paul. And those were known to him and those hearing him as the spiritual wickedness in high places. It's where the teachings and doctrines that were completely adverse to the doctrines of Yahweh, Paul's God, came from. And it was clearly the spiritual wickedness in high places that Paul and his group were contending with. Let's take a look at what the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia has to say about these high places. I assure you, it's different than what we've been taught they are in common spiritual warfare circles. The high places are places of worship, specifically of idolatrous worship. So, the title was transferred from the elevation to the sanctuary on the elevation. And it goes on to say, this came to be used of any idolatrous shrine, whether constructed on an elevation or not. So the high places in the cities could have stood anywhere. This is the spiritual wickedness in high places we find Paul telling us is one of our battles. Now, when we look at this passage, there are a number of things we need to remember as we try to understand what was the spiritual warfare passage about if it's not about a supernatural cosmic entity and his minions that we're supposed to be doing battle against. We find the things to remember when reading this passage are, first of all, the wiles of the devil are the false teachings of the men who run anti-God religions. Next, the battle that's going on against philosophies and beliefs is not against flesh and blood. It's against principalities, which principalities are the political religious leaders such as a magistrate would be, as we found in Titus chapter 3. And then the powers that we're also doing battle against is really the word exousia in Greek, and it refers to man's power of choice and the propensity to choose false teachings. The rulers of darkness, we can remember those to be the men who have a darkened sight when dealing with truth. They're incapable of seeing the truth and therefore forcefully guide the consciousness of this world by their errors, which they cannot themselves see are errors. And finally, in a heavily paganized Ephesian environment, the battle was often against the false and unscriptural teaching that came from the pagan high places and the men who ran them. Folks, it's not that complicated, and I'd love you to email me if you have any questions. Please send your email to Brayshaw@scog.ca or check the ImagineNoSatan.com website. And if you want a free copy of Volume 1 of this 4-volume book series, please email me with that request as well. I'm James Brayshaw, and thanks for taking a moment to have a look at this famous spiritual warfare passage that is not about spiritual warfare at all.